Welcome and thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's really great to be here with you all. My name is Carrie. I'm the head of movement coaching here at Neon and your host for this webinar. This is the second of 3 webinars in our series entitled Running Successful Movement Organizations, Introducing 3 Practical Toolkits. And today we're here to talk about all things organizational culture with a focus on conflict and feedback. I'm joined here today by Paul from an organization called Navigate, who is going to be talking a bit more about that, and I will introduce him more fully shortly. For those of us who don't know Neon, please allow me to do a quick introduction. If any of you were here last week at our first webinar, then you can tune out for about a minute. Neon exists to support and strengthen social justice movements, and we do this through 2 core strands of work. Our movement building team delivers training, coaching, and group facilitation for organizers, campaigners, and other movement leaders to build individual and collective skills, capacity, and resilience. And our comms team delivers our spokesperson and press officer training and messaging and framing work on how to get progressive messages out into the world and widen political discourse and representation. And all of our work within Neon is supported by our oft forgotten ops team, who do all of the behind the scenes work to support Neon, as well as holding and driving Neon's culture and values. So yeah, special shout out to them today because a lot of their work has inspired this toolkit. Part of the work that we do at Neon, both externally through our programs, in particular our org builders and help desk programs, and internally through the work of our ops team, is think very deeply about how organizations function and what makes for healthy movement organizations. We see having a healthy culture as being really central to that. And when we talk about healthy cultures, I'm going to explain this more shortly, but in summary, we see that as working with a really clear set of values and principles, seeking to consciously create progressive, inclusive, and liberatory cultures within their own organizations, and seeking to redress injustice that is present in dominant cultures and create spaces to explore how we do that and strive for that. This is the principle that underlines the 3 toolkits that we have developed on organizational strategy, organizational culture, and structure and operations. Last week, we had our first webinar on strategy. On Thursday, we'll do our 3rd webinar on structure and operations. So yeah, and the recordings will be available if you missed that one last week or if you're not able to attend. These toolkits draw together work that Neon is doing and has been doing both within our own organization and in working with others, and bringing together the work of organizations, collectives, and individuals across the world whose insights and tools we have shared here. And yeah, some really amazing work out there. So what we're really aiming to do is just provide an entry point, kind of showcase some of that work, bring it to people's consciousness, put it all in one place, and then allow you to be able to explore that and follow the links for where you want to go deeper and further to more resources. So yeah, so as I said, today we're going to be looking at organizational culture, a quick run through of what's going to happen over the next hour. Grace, if I could ask you to share the screen. Great. So we've just done the introduction. I'm going to do a short few minutes now on what we mean by organizational culture and introducing some of the key themes from the toolkit. I will then introduce you to Paul, and he is going to be talking a little bit about his work related to organizational culture more broadly, and then doing a focus in on conflict and feedback mechanisms at an organizational level. There will be time to answer your questions. Please do, you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please do ask questions in there as we go. We'll have some time at the end to answer questions, and we might be able to answer some of them by sort of typing in our replies as well. So keep the questions coming and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Okay, so I will kick us off with a short introduction by what do we mean by organizational culture? This is something that I'm sure that a lot of you have feelings on, and probably some very differing perspectives and opinions out there. So allow me to introduce what we mean and how we've approached this. If you could bring up the next slide, please, Grace. Thank you. So we've described culture as being the emotional backdrop to your organization. The answer to the questions, what does it feel like to work here? By that we mean, for example, do people feel safe and supported? Do people feel like they know what's going on? Do people feel like they have what they need to be able to do their job? Do people trust each other? Do they trust the organization? Do they trust the people in charge? Do they feel like it's okay to make mistakes? So those are the kinds of things that feed into like how we feel when we work somewhere and what it feels like to work in an organization. And then the second part of that is like, how do we go about achieving our goals? Last week in our strategy toolkit, we talked a lot about, creating that strategic vision, figuring out like, what are we here to achieve as an organization, and what is our purpose and direction. And culture is really about what underpins that. How do you do that work? What are the values that underpin that? Do you seek to work collectively? Do you seek to work in collaboration with others? Do you seek to work with an attitude of curiosity and learning and trying to figure out and improve things as you go? What is the way that you go about that? And that's kind of what we've defined culture as, this very broad and vague concept. With that, if you could bring up the next slide, please, Grace. We've come up with these kind of 3 underlying principles. One is that cultures are created, that they are intentional spaces, that we can create the type of environments that we want to see and that we want to share with others, and that we can intentionally sort of make that within our organizations and build that. The second principle is that cultures need nurturing. They need care and attention to help them grow in ways that we want them to, and to change the things that we don't want. And this is particularly important when we're seeking to create cultures that are in opposition to the dominant culture. Every day we're kind of out in the world and working within environments that are quite difficult, and many of us will experience injustice within that. And if we're not paying attention, and if we're not seeking to consciously create alternative spaces to that, then those dominant cultures will very likely show up within our organization. So that nurturing and that ongoing work is really important. And the final principle is that we believe that fundamentally this is rewarding. It is hard, and it is sometimes feels thankless, but ultimately when you do get things right, it is also a rewarding thing. And trying to make this, hold on to that idea of it being rewarding, and maybe even that idea of it being fun, is a real opportunity to kind of build the organization to be the best that it can be, and hold on to sort of the good elements of that work while you're going through it, because there will be times when it is hard and when it is challenging. So yeah, trying to keep a sort of positive spin on that. Thinking about, Grace, if we can move to the next slide, why culture is important. I feel like a lot of the time this, you often hear what I like to call the business case for working on your culture, which is this third point here, is that it helps us win. And the quote that's there at the bottom, culture eats strategy for breakfast, is something that we hear, well, certainly I hear a lot. And it is absolutely true. Without a good culture, you will not achieve the work. But I think that the other 2 points are equally important, and particularly for social justice movement organizations, particularly for people who are striving to create change in the world. Actually, we need a place of psychological safety to work from. We need a place that is in opposition to the dominant culture, where we may not feel safe. It provides that baseline level of security where we can bring our whole selves. And this is particularly important when we're not able to do that in the wider world. And we need a culture that empowers and inspires us. A good culture helps creativity thrive. It supports people to work at their best. And that means trying new ideas, taking risks, making mistakes, and being able to bounce back. And a lot of the work we do is difficult, and we will face challenges, and we will face setbacks in our fight for structural and systemic change. it has a lot of highs and lows. So a resilient and empowering culture can really provide a safe and restorative environment for us to be able to find fresh motivation for when times are really tough. So yes, it helps us achieve our strategy, it helps us do the work that we do, but this sort of wider element of like how it supports people is equally important part of the work. So these are the kind of principles that we've thought quite long and hard about and that we've brought into the toolkits. So that's a kind of brief summary. I'm now going to hand over to Paul, who also spends a lot of time thinking very deeply about some of these concepts and is here to share that with us today. Paul is an experienced facilitator, mediator, and trainer, focusing on supporting groups through conflict, tricky decision-making, and the process of developing their systems. His approach is grounded in the deep principles of nonviolent communication, restorative circles, convergent facilitation, Aikido, and focusing, along with several other approaches and practices. His work is focused on supporting groups, projects, communities, and organizations working for transformation and social and ecological justice. And I'm really, really delighted that he could join us here today. So Paul, over to you. Please take it away.
Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everyone. And yeah, thanks for inviting me to present about this. And like Carrie said, I also find all of these things that Carrie's just been talking about super important. And I'm also really fascinated and passionate about them and how developing our culture and our structures is fundamental to creating healthy and effective ways of working. I just wanted to say that as this webinar is about culture, and I'm bringing in this approach that we're calling living systems within Navigate, the organisation I work for, that quite a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, it kind of falls, some of it under culture and some of it maybe also touches on stuff that you'll look at in the work around structures as well. So it kind of doesn't sit purely in culture, but hopefully it will be relevant enough. So what I'd like to do in the time that I'm going to talk now is just say a little bit about what I mean by this living systems idea and why it might be useful to look at them, which Carrie's already touched on a bit. I want to look at a few things to take into account when developing systems, and to give some examples from around looking at conflict and feedback. And then, yeah, really interested to hear your questions. Grace, just wanted to check, I'm a bit confused by the webinar format and just wanted to check, are you waiting for my call to start sharing the slides?
Yep, I can share the slides now.
Great, thank you. So yeah, if we could go to the next one, and that's just a little overview of what I'd like to cover in the next half hour. So yeah, I'll just say a few things first of all to introduce the idea of living systems, and I want to acknowledge that a lot of this work is really inspired by primarily someone called Dominic Barter and his colleagues who've done a lot of work in Brazil around systems, also the work of Mickey Kashtan, and many others as well. I've on the next slide just put a little image of some starlings in a murmuration, and that's partly because, and the reason that we've called this approach living systems is to try and one reason for calling it that is to hopefully make it more three-dimensional and dynamic, that what I mean by systems is not just policies and procedures and things that you write down in documents. It's something living and changing and evolving. So I love watching starlings do this, and for me it feels like an inspiration of how can we work together. So on to the next slide. A system you could think of simply as a number of interrelated elements interacting as a larger whole ongoingly. So, for example, the respiratory system that brings oxygen into our bodies and carbon dioxide out, or a forest as an ecosystem. And there's often systems within systems, like a tree within a forest. And then a social system could think of as a way that a collective of people handle some aspect of life ongoingly. So when I'm talking about living social systems, I mean really everything that makes up and influences the ongoing way that things happen, understood as a dynamic, interrelated whole, and more than the sum of its parts. So just as an example, we could think about there being a decision-making system right now here amongst us. There's inevitably a lot of decisions happening all the time. I'm making decisions, you listening or watching are making decisions, and we've got that individual level, but that also comes together to form collective decisions. And inevitably within that, there's a particular kind of shape to how we're making decisions, and there's a specific distribution of power in this system. For example, right now, I've got a lot more power in certain ways by the fact that I'm presenting, we're in a webinar, so you who are watching are not able to speak right now in the way that I am. So what this living systems work is about is looking at the systemic conditions that make some things make sense and others not, the context that supports some things to happen or makes things harder to happen. So one way I like to think of this is like a game where the object of a game and its rules shape the behaviors, including ways of cheating. So for example, when I play this game called Werewolf, which some of you might have come across, it's all about lying, basically. So when I play that game, I start lying, whereas in the rest of my life, I try and be pretty honest, or as honest as I can be. So looking at the conditions that shape behaviors, and I also like thinking of it a little bit like the way that the banks of the river shape the flow of water, but also the flow of water shapes the banks of the river. An example that I like thinking of when thinking about social systems is just telling a little story of, say, someone goes into a shop and takes some bread and puts it under their coat and tries to leave, and they're not paying for that bread. They're trying to leave, and maybe a security guard sees them and tries to stop them. In our current justice system, that might be looked at as just, did they break a law? If so, they'll be punished. In another type of justice system, we might listen into the layers of feedback in that example are about our social systems. So there's a lot of information contained within that event about our economic system. Also, the fact that when the person sees a security guard coming towards them, maybe they run. That also tells us a lot about our justice system as well. That the person didn't walk towards the person saying the reasons why they've taken this bread, and that's the only option they had for feeding themselves, because they don't actually hope to experience much justice from our current justice system. So for me, that's an example of individual actions giving us a lot of feedback about our social systems. So we can listen for and track feedback on our systems and notice patterns and what's shaping or influencing those patterns. And an important distinction here is the distinction between an explicit and implicit system. So whether or not people acknowledge it, the idea here is that there's always going to be a system. You can't avoid having a way of engaging with conflict, or a way of making decisions, or a way of sharing resources. Sometimes you'll acknowledge that that's a system, and sometimes people aren't talking about it as a system. But from my perspective, it always is going to be a system. And another distinction that's kind of related to that is the distinction between the system, the way we talk about it, and what's actually happening. So again, a reminder that I don't mean just policies and procedures. They shape the system in some ways, they're part of the system, but they're not the actual whole living system. So now I'd like to move on to the next slide and just talk a little bit about why systems, why focus on systems, or why might they be useful and important. I think Carrie's already touched on this, but so one thing, like I was just saying, is that from my perspective, it's not a question of whether or not we have systems, it's just a question of which ones. And if we don't choose the ones we want, we're very likely to inherit the patterns that are dominant in our society. So a lot of the time, if a group hasn't looked at how it wants to handle conflict, it's likely to inherit what you could call a punitive system for handling conflict, where you look for who's right and who's wrong, and you punish whoever you think is wrong with an imposition of power on them. And a lot of the time, the systems that we'll inherit are ones that can concentrate power where power is already concentrated. They increase that concentration of power and are focused on the experiences or preferences of those with more power a lot of the time. So if we don't choose the systems we want, they'll be often doing things like that, concentrating power resources in the hands of those who already have them. Whereas if we choose the systems we want, we can actually align them with our purpose and our values, or focus them on actually meeting needs. And another important element of this is not relying on individuals and their capacity or resources, and building our systems for conditions that might be challenging as well, so that they can actually carry us through those difficult moments. And also to understand individual actions as within a context. And often if you shift the context, that's a way of shifting things that you might otherwise think of as individual issues. A lot of time with my work with conflict, it might be that people are really frustrated with a particular person in an organization, and they start to think that person's a bit of an idiot or difficult to work with. But if you can look at something like the decision-making system and realize that there's a lack of clarity or a lack of agreement about how decisions are made, and then you work with that, the person who's doing things that people had labeled as individual issues actually stops acting in that way, because there's the conditions have changed. Another really important part about this is anchoring this in a really practical, doable level. Going back to this idea I was saying of the banks of the river shape how the water flows. So it's possible to talk about changing, we want to have a culture of feedback, or we want to look after well-being in our organization, but it can be difficult to know how to actually make that happen on a day-to-day level. So one way that I like thinking about this is a couple of months ago, a housemate of mine kept trying to remember to take something to work with her, and she kept forgetting it, and she even left it next to the door, but still forgot it. So then we came up with the idea that she would leave it in her shoe, and that's when she did actually remember to take it. So how can we build our living systems in a way that kind of guide us and redirect us towards what we want to be doing in that kind of level of specific practicality, like leaving something in your shoe to make sure you don't forget it. Also looking at why work on our systems, that I think Carrie has already mentioned this, they can help us actually model and experiment with living in alignment with our values, living and working in alignment with our values. And one last kind of key distinction that feels important to me around why it's important to look at our systems is that a lot of the time, if we inherit the systems from the dominant culture, they'll be based on some form of competition and hierarchy, and we might want to shift them to being collaborative. So I just wanted to share on the next slide one of my favorite quotes, and it's a bit long and complicated, so I won't go into it now, but it's there for you to look back at if you want. It's from a woman called Mary Parker Follett. But the sort of summary version of it is that she's saying there are basically just three ways of handling differences or conflicts. One is win-lose, another is lose-lose, and another is win-win. And the reason I like this quote is that it just lays it out in such a clear and simple way from my perspective. There's just those three options, And then when you see that there's those three options, which do you want it to be? So I'd like to move on now to talking about, on the next slide, the 7 systems model that we use. So first of all, I just want to say that this is one way of cutting the cake. You could cut, like any cake, you could cut it in different directions, and that these different ways of cutting the cake would make sense. It's just the one that we found helpful. It's based on Mickey Kashtan's work, where she has 5 systems. We've added a couple more in that we find it important to have our attention on as well. But if you find it useful to cut the cake slightly differently, and focus in on an area more and give that a name, then that's fine. Really, the point of it is for it to be useful. So yeah, the 7 systems in no particular order that we are working with is our decision making, conflict engagement or conflict transformation, support and care, resource distribution, feedback, connection and community, and information flow. And together these make up a larger whole system. Yeah, these are I often find this a very helpful framework because it's a way of looking quite specifically at different areas, and when something's not working, you can sort of look at, is it somehow one of these things that could, one of these systems that could use some attention or some work. Just checking if there's anything else I wanted to say around that. Yeah, just wanted to say that sometimes there are other things that you might think of as being crucial things in this area. So I would say looking at your purpose and your values are things that I would suggest often to look at first before looking at these 7 systems, so that you can then almost like have these systems organized by your purpose and your values, and an expression of those. Also that just want to flag up that power runs through all of these systems, and I'll say a little bit more around power getting on to the next slide now. So this is the idea of conditions or preconditions that comes from Dominic Barter's work. So the idea is that the stronger each of these are, the more likely it is that your system is going to be working well and strong, and the weaker, the less likely it is to be functioning well. So these aren't in really any particular order, but I always like to start with agreement or engagement first. So the idea that it's just a fundamental question is, what is the actual level of agreement to this system? So I'll use a conflict system as an example of going through these. So say I'm part of an organization with, say, 20 people in it, and we want to shift or get clearer on how we want to engage with conflict and tension in our organization. So it's important, if we're wanting to develop a system that's actually going to happen, for there to be genuine agreement, both to the spirit or the kind of the paradigm or the principles of that system, and to the practical, what that practically looks like day to day. So if the agreement is very low, or I come along with, I'm feeling really inspired about how we can engage with conflict, but no one else is really on board with it, or particular people, maybe particular power holders, are not on board with it, then it's probably not going to work. So in a way, you can judge the level of agreement by what actually happens. Are people following this this new idea of a new way of engaging with conflict or not? That's very related then to, is everyone clear on how the system works? Information. So if we worked in an organization where we actually were in a building together, in an office or something like that, it might be that we want to have a really clear, easily accessible representation of the system up on the wall, like a big flow chart, for example, or a sort of quite colorful, easy to engage with image, rather than it being a a document that is filed away in some filing cabinet or some electronic drive that no one ever really actually looks at. How does that information come to people and actually shape their choices and actions? Also, looking at power in this one, if, for example, you have a conflict system within a school and the information is provided in a way that only some people can access it because only some people in that school can read, some people have not yet learned to read in that school, then you're immediately imbalancing information and therefore imbalancing the distribution of power in the system. Access is also very connected with that, and so this is looking at how do people in the organization reach out for the support of that system, but also you can look at how does the system come and reach towards people to support them. So, for example, in a conflict system, it might be that we have a clear way of reaching out for support. Maybe there's an email address or a number or a signal group or whatever it is, where you can say, oh, I'm in a conflict, I'm struggling with something, I'd like some support, and that's your way of letting people know. In the UK context, everyone knows that if you need an ambulance, you ring 999. So that's a really clear, well-established access mechanism. But then you can also look at, particularly around conflict, but also in relation to other systems, if people might have quite a lot of concerns or fears around engaging with conflict, you might want to have some way that you actually go and check with people actively what conflict or tensions do you have. So yeah, someone might come and check with me, hey Paul, what are you struggling with working with your colleagues? What support would you like with that? So that's much more likely to sense and respond to conflict early if the access mechanism comes to check with people. Then resources and capacity. So this is about building whatever system you've got within the resources and capacity that you realistically got. That can also include using that capacity to build capacity. So you can develop the capacity, and a big part of this would be about the kind of what you could call human resources of a system. If, for example, in a conflict system, there are some people who are trained to be able to sit with people and support them to have dialogue that is hopefully productive and helpful, how do you develop that capacity in the system, and how do you look after that capacity ongoingly? If there are facilitators who come and sit with people in conflict, how do we make sure they're well looked after, and how do you make sure that people are tending to the system, have got attention on what's going on with the system, where does it need work, or where could it be developed? And then time and space. This is very practically, how do we carve out time for engaging with our conflicts, and also how do we look after the physical space in which we meet. So if there's a conflict, it might be important that we don't meet in a space that imbalances power, but actually actively works to balance power. So a space where everyone feels comfortable and safe. So this is really about thinking about the context, the physical context, the practical context, but also on a more symbolic level, how do we sort of carve out time and space in a way that values engaging with conflict? How do we set aside time for that, knowing that conflict is going to arise? Also, if we meet in a space, how can we construct that space in a way that's... I was once working with a group, a community, and someone said that when we were talking about this in relation to conflict, he said he didn't want the space where we engage with conflict to be kind of out on the edge of the community, kind of locked away, but he wanted it to be somewhere right in the middle of the community, that was very visible, in order to send the message to everyone. Yes, we acknowledge that engaging with conflict is a fundamental part of living in this community together. And then feedback is just about looking at how do you listen for and respond to forms of feedback about how the system is going. So that could be feedback on each of these conditions or preconditions that I've spoken about already, or other things about who's accessing the system, who's not, how a process is, how, for example, conflict process is going, this kind of thing. That leads me on to the next slide, where so I wanted to give an example from my organisation where we have, as part of our feedback system, we have 2 regular meetings. One is a space for giving feedback, giving and receiving feedback as individuals. So we do that every week after our weekly meeting. We have a short, sort of about half an hour space to give and receive feedback, and it's really important to us that that's also positive feedback, celebrating things about working together, but also giving each other kind of constructive feedback about things that are not working so well. So that's a way to give feedback as an individual to another individual. But then we also have this other space which we use to look at our system. So that connects with the final precondition that I was just talking about. So anytime that we're noticing that something's not working so well about how we work together, rather than that being something that we just don't really know what to do with, we have a way of understanding that as being feedback about our living systems. And we have a specific meeting, which also happens once a week, where we look at how can we improve our systems based on that feedback. So it could be that someone notices that we've made an agreement about how we're going to do something and no one's following that agreement. And then we realize that no one knows where to find the information on that. So instead of having it tucked away in some online drive or file, for example, you can print it out and keep it right next to your desk. Like right now, under my laptop, I've got a document that has a bunch of our agreements about how we work printed out, so that I don't have to go and look on some file, but I could sort of stick it up right next to my desk, or I can refer to it whenever I need to. So that's just a quick example of that approach, and I just wanted to reference that idea was partly for us inspired by something that they use in a system called Holacracy, where there's dedicated spaces for actively bringing tensions and understanding those tensions as almost like a doorway or a pathway to the evolution of how we work together. So it's actually inviting tensions as a productive and useful thing. And by engaging with feedback and engaging with those forms of tensions early, they don't need to turn into interpersonal tensions, hopefully. So moving on to the last slide now, I just wanted to talk a little bit briefly about how to develop and evolve systems. So part of the context I'm saying this in is that there's already a living system if your group or organisation already exists. From my perspective, there's already something there. So a really important thing, and this goes back to the agreement precondition, the idea that you can't really separate the sort of the outcome of your system from the process of developing it. So if you build agreement carefully and you really engage with people, including if they have concerns or they're saying no to something, rather than trying to push through that or ignore it, actually seeing that itself as useful information and a way that if you engage with that, if you listen to what they're saying yes to behind the no that they're saying, you can actually make a stronger system that has a higher level of agreement. There's many different ways of shifting systems. I just wanted to refer to the work of Donella Meadows in relation to her work around different ways of shifting systems. But one of the primary approaches that we use comes from the work of Dominic Barter, and that's essentially about listening to what is currently working well, what's not working so well, and see if people have a vision, and people often do, if they're just asked in a way that they're really being listened to. If they have a vision of what they would like to see. So you could ask that, for example, around a decision-making system or a conflict engagement system. What's working well, or what have you seen work well around engaging with conflict? What have you seen not working so well? And how would you really like it to look? What would it look like if it really aligned with your values? And then the final thing I wanted to say is that that process of developing systems in a collaborative way, so that you're not trying to develop a collaborative system in a non-collaborative way, but you're actually, the process of developing it is in itself collaborative. My strong encouragement is that you might need to look at, it might be helpful to look at what support you need in order to be able to do that. So from my perspective, your ability to develop it in a collaborative way is going to be massively influenced by the kind of support you have. So if you're trying to do it alone and you're encountering a lot of disagreement, or people not really joining with you and working with you, you could easily, if you're trying to do it on your own, really struggle with that and get a bit lost and give up, or try and just force it through. If you manage to have more support, you might be able to engage with those concerns or disagreements or lack of engagement in a way that allows you to keep listening and keep engaging, and value the fact that people aren't just saying yes and just going along with it. And then just on the final slide, just wanted to give you a place to follow up. So that's our website, www.navigate.org.uk, and we've got a program that we're developing at the moment, which is an online course going into much more depth around each of the 7 systems and how to work with them. So if you've got inquiries about that, you can email the email address that's there. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul. That's really, really wonderful to hear you talk about this work. It's so fascinating. We've had a couple of questions. So firstly from Rebecca, who has asked, regarding checking in around what conflict or tensions that you have. We've tried to add this question to people's meetings with their line managers to help us identify and resolve conflict as it comes up. But it's really awkward because of the power structure there that you're telling your manager, and feels quite like telling on my colleagues. What are your recommendations for navigating this, or should it not be your designated line manager that checks in with you around this? I'd just be worried about then putting other pressures on others in the team. So yeah.
Thank you for this question. I feel like it touches on something really, really important around the challenges that come up around working in a more collaborative way when there is the possibility of some sort of negative consequences coming to you or to your colleagues. It's a little bit like that thing that they say, if you're getting arrested in this country, they say to you, as you're getting arrested, anything you say may be used against you, which is often when people are lower down in a hierarchy, they're very aware that of the possible consequences to them or others of saying certain things or doing certain things. So I think, yeah, just off the top of my head, I think that it would be really interesting to explore, like you said, having that way of checking be done in a way that's not done by the line manager, so that someone essentially can answer that question honestly without fear of consequences to them or to their colleagues. I think that it's also very tricky in a hierarchical context, because even if I tell someone else, I know that if I'm going to actually engage with the conflict or the tension, I know that there might be consequences to my colleague, but also to me. If I sort of expose myself as having tension with someone, it might be that will make me look bad in some way or not get a promotion. So I think that's part of the question around agreement, is looking at to what extent are we actually able to shift over to a more collaborative way of engaging with conflict, and where and are there ways that we can actually remove some of those consequences and make it a safer space for people? And also, yeah, I'm not saying this in any way to criticize the structure that you do have. I think that just being really, really clear and upfront about that, I think that's one of the most important things in my mind when there is a hierarchical structure, is to be totally transparent and clear about it. So there's some kids that I know that I'm close to, and they're now teenagers, and every now and then they say to me something like, "Can I tell you this thing?" But you know, don't you know? They're checking out whether I'm going to tell on them essentially to their mum, and what I say to them is. I'm trying to be really clear. Like, if you say things that fall in this category and I'm not worried about anyone's well-being, then I'm not going to tell anyone. But if you tell me about stuff that goes in that category, then I would want to tell, because if I'm worried about whether or not you're safe, then I might want to tell. So I try and let them know that before they start speaking, so they have the choice. I don't know if that's a good way of approaching it, but something about being really clear, because sometimes there are going to be consequences, and being fully transparent about that so people can make their choices. Anyway, yeah, I feel like that it's a really, really important question. I'd love to explore it more, but that's just a few thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So interesting. I guess it comes back to this idea of like surfacing what sort of power looks like in these situations and having a really good understanding of that within an organization. I'm going to throw an addition into your answer, if that's acceptable, around the kind of, yeah, I think like with hierarchies, you have like this very often very clear sort of power dynamic. And I think that within flatter structures, that dynamic exists, but is often less well defined or less clear. So equally important to understand what that looks like and how it's playing out in these situations. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are so many different forms of power, and I think it's so important, and particularly in a sort of flat structure, to be really as clear and real as we can about the different forms of power that are in balancing how things work in that context. And again, that there might even be, there are forms of power that make it easier for someone to speak, or easier for someone to be understood, or less. But there's also forms of power that actually mean that people will also get delivered consequences in that kind of, what you say may be used against you kind of way. Just because there isn't a structural hierarchy, that doesn't mean there's not consequences coming your way if you say certain things or if you don't say certain things.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. I'll move on to the next question. Joel has asked, is there a way to have visionary leadership figures and have healthy, progressive, inclusive organizational systems? I witnessed a major environmental civil disobedience group implode from the inside over this very problem. Can it be solved? Big questions.
Yeah, big question. I guess I'll just say a couple of thoughts that come to mind. So again, going back to the thing about clarity, I think and I think it's possible to have people in particular roles that are very clearly and well defined. This is actually something that Holacracy is just one approach that I find interesting amongst many. But just referring to Holacracy again, I think there's a real clarity about the definition of roles in Holacracy, and that because a role and its accountabilities are defined very specifically, you can actually, hopefully, through that, have a way of giving someone a very specific role, which might be some sort of strategic leadership or some sort of vision holding leadership, but that doesn't need to accidentally then kind of blend into them having a load of other implicit roles just because they've got that one. So, for example, it's something that we've been discussing within Navigate, is the possibility of having one or two people who hold the strategy role because they're particularly into strategy, or particularly, we particularly like the way that they do it, but not then meaning that they have a load of other implicit power, but they have a very defined mandate for strategy, but that doesn't influence other forms of decision making, or how they then get treated differently when there's a conflict or whatever. So I think trying to define exactly what that role is and is not can make it possible to be very collaborative whilst still moving certain areas off into particular roles that can be really supportive to do that, I think.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah. I'm kind of interested in the sort of binary that's been presented here. Because I think when I read this question, my instinctual reaction was like, but visionary leadership, I'm having a real hard time with these words. Visionary leadership to me is that which is about progressive and inclusive systems. And to me, those two things go hand in hand. And I think, yeah, what is your vision if it's not for a future that's more inclusive than the one we have now, in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, I think I'm curious about the binary here. To me, they're part and parcel of the same thing as well.
Mm. I just wanted to add on that. I really agree, and I think that it's useful to think about what is the vision. Is it a vision for what we're going to do externally in the world, or is it the vision for how we're going to work internally? And it seems to me really important that both of those are held really strongly, and they could be held by the same person or they could be held by different people. But often the idea of being a leader or being visionary can have a sort of, this is what we're going to do over there kind of connotations to it. And I really agree with what you're saying, Carrie, that's, if you only have that, then things will fall apart internally a lot of the time, and you can't even achieve that external bit, because if you're not looking after your health internally, you can't do anything great and sustained externally, probably.
Yeah, circle back round to the culture eat strategy for breakfast type situation. Yeah, thank you, Paul. So we've got 3 more questions here that I think we'll have time to answer. And after that, I think we'll probably be out of time. So Liz wants to know, interested to hear Paul's thoughts about creating a positive culture in networks and partnerships that involve multiple organizations and all sorts of implicit rather than explicit hierarchies and power imbalances. What say you?
Thanks. Yeah, I guess another big question that is really like, I think that we'll just need a lot of thinking and feeling about over a lot more time. But I feel like this work, this, for example, the living systems approach, or everything that's going into the toolkits, it might have, like, I've been doing that work primarily within one organization at a time, or one project or community at a time. But I also think that any kind of larger configuration of people coming together, they will also have these living systems between them. So each, in the same way that each team will have its own decision-making system in a sense that's then related to the larger organizations, then also each organization will have a system that is related to and part of a larger whole of these different organizations working together. So and this is a strand of work that we're just developing in Navigate at the moment, is looking at how to support larger networks or coalitions or alliances to come together and have these systems in place at that level as well. So when you've got, say, 5 different groups coming together, looking directly and looking together at how are we going to make decisions together? How are we going to handle tensions and conflicts, knowing that tension and conflict is going to arise in a similar way that we know that we're going to get hungry, so we build ourselves a kitchen, or we know we're going to get tired, so we build ourselves a bed. Before that happens, if possible, before you're even starting to do, or alongside trying to do external work as a coalition or a network, looking at, hey, we know that we're going to sometimes disagree. How do we want to handle that? and as part of that conversation, looking at the power imbalances, and that if you've got a good conflict system, hopefully you've got a way of engaging when things start to not go so well in terms of those power imbalances. More to say, but yeah, that's some thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Thank you, Paul. And really interesting to hear about that work happening. I'm sure that'll be an interesting evolution. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. This is an interesting one, actually. How can one express their views effectively in a conflict process when they are the biggest power holder in an organization, not wanting to bias or disempower others, but still flagging what has been going wrong? Yeah, lot to say here.
Yeah. So one thing is, I think of like this model of almost like first aid when I'm supporting groups working with developing their conflict systems. Is, you don't train everyone to be a paramedic or a surgeon, but you can train a few people to be first aiders. And so when you've got a conflict that is very complex or has got really, really painful or really tense, I'd really recommend in those situations having an external facilitator, a trained professional, basically a trained mediator or conflict facilitator who can come in. And so that's one way of actually creating a space where everyone can be safe and supported, and people with less power and people with more power can come together and have a conversation and be real and honest and say what they need to say, but with the support of a mediator or mediators. I think another thing, going back to the being fully as fully honest as you can, being clear what the consequences are. Because if, say, Carrie's my boss and I go into a conflict process with Carrie, and if I say certain things in my sort of attempt to honestly engage with the conflict, and then Carrie says, okay, I'm going to fire Paul now for having said that, then we've basically tried to create a kind of restorative or transformative conflict process, but in a context that's actually dominated by a punitive or power over kind of system. So being really clear, yes, if you say certain things, it's possible that I will fire you, or I won't give you a promotion, or whatever it is. I might not like you so much. So just being very clear about what is at stake and what are the consequences.
Yeah, yeah, so interesting. I don't think I would fire you, Paul, but you never know. Yeah, I think it's also quite interesting how like power changes people as well. So I think often when you kind of take up positions of leadership, like your relationship to power is different, but you might not feel that difference, and that can kind of cause things to come out in ways that maybe you didn't expect, where other people in the organization are like, oh, but this is the person with the power, even though you're not perceiving that yourself, and therefore maybe not like wielding it in ways that you think that you would have or would perhaps like to.
Yeah, something a way of defining power, just one way that I've heard, is how often you hear no. And I think often people are much more aware of where they don't have power than where they do have power. And I think that's, yeah, a really important point to try and think about what are the ways that I have power that I wouldn't see because I have that power.
Yeah, oh, that's so interesting. Thank you. Okay, we're coming on to our last question. Thanks to those who are still with us. We're just running a couple of minutes over, but yeah, we'll wrap up this last question. How important is communicating, managing, and reinforcing a new system in an organization? Is this often not given enough time and resources, and so new systems don't work? And this would also be important for making things accessible and inclusive.
Yeah, I think this often is not given anywhere near as much time and resource as I would really like. And I feel like a large part of my job is going around responding to the consequences of that, really, that people end up in conflict, or burning out, or all sorts of, yeah, tensions and stresses that happen because of it. And I guess one way of thinking of it going back to what we were talking about around visionary leadership, I think that in a way, if you're going to come up with an external facing strategy that's like hopefully a pathway to fulfilling what you're trying to do in the world as effectively or powerfully as possible, that just as important as that is your kind of internal strategy, in a sense. Like in the same way that if me and Carrie are gonna, I don't know, try and pull down a wall together, but we're in a huge amount of conflict with each other, or we don't have a way of communicating with each other, our ability to do that is going to be so much diminished if we haven't figured out how we're going to communicate and collaborate and handle any disagreements or differences we have. So yeah, I really think that being realistic about the resources that are needed and prioritizing that as a strategic something that's strategically essential, basically. Which also I think it's important that it doesn't mean that you end up spending all of your time and resources on that. It's about finding a balance. But I think if you don't look after one or the other, your internal or your external, then I think it's going to have pretty negative consequences most of the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree. And I always find it really helpful when the information comes at me in like a few different formats. I feel like if something's mentioned once in a meeting, I might not remember it. But if that's then followed up with like an email or a message in Slack, or like, the next time in a team meeting, like, oh yeah, we remembered that. Like, I think something to hold here is that, we're all kind of busy. We all have our priorities. We're all sort of working with tunnel vision a lot of the time. And it can sometimes take a few attempts to like get the information like through that barrier and get it to sink in and get people to understand like, okay, a response is expected here, or this is something I need to engage with. So thinking about the different ways that that information can be presented and shared, to make sure that like it's not just like, oh, but we told people that this was happening, so why don't they know? It's like, tell people tell people again and again and again, because it is it's really, really important, really valuable. Yeah,
Definitely.
great. Well, Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, for taking your time, for giving us your thoughts and insights. It's been so interesting to hear you speak about all this stuff. I really have enjoyed listening to you talk. So thank you very much. It's been wonderful. And thank you to everybody for coming here this evening, for your wonderful questions. Hopefully we've been able to sort of share some insights here. We are at the end. You will have an email from us tomorrow, kind of sharing some links to where you can get a poll. We'll share the information for Navigate's website and that email address, so you can follow up with that. And you'll get a link to where you can download our toolkit. And for additional support around that. So hopefully that will come in useful. And that's it. We'll say goodbye and thank you all for coming, and hope you all have wonderful evenings.